Hello and welcome back to the second set of slides for week 4 or module 4 on intercultural communication. And here we're going to basically ask a simple question, why we should even study this. So what I'd like to do here is to move from the initial questions or the objections that a person may have to studying this to moving towards our assignment for this week. What I'd like to start with is a quote by Edward Hall from one of his books that we're going to look at very briefly. If one is to prosper in this new world, a globalized world, without being battered, one must transcend one's own system. In other words, one must be able to step outside of one's own culture. To do so, two things must be known. First, that there is a system, and secondly, the nature of the system. What is more, the only way to master either is to seek out systems that are different from one's own, and using oneself as a sensitive recording device, make note of every reaction or tendency. So this is what Edward Hall asks us to do as we step outside of our comfort zone, we step outside of our culture, our normal way of doing things, and we look around and see how other people behave and think and act and talk. That's what we're going to be doing here. Now, this is also important because it's part of our course learning outcomes. Specifically, number 4, describe, demonstrate, and evaluate effective team, group, and meeting management strategies based on audience. Specifically, increase awareness and identify cultural differences. And that's really what we're going to do. So why should we study it? Well, there's a lot of good reasons. One, at the very least, no matter what you do during a communications course, a course without a component on intercultural communication is kind of sadly lacking. It's really sort of not paying attention to the world as it presently is. But still, people may have some objections. The first one here, how can students study intercultural communication when they are unable to adequately define and describe what culture even means? Now, can you describe culture? What does it consist of? Well, culture is art. Culture is religion. Culture is politics. Culture is aesthetic thought. It's the philosophy of a particular community. So culture means a lot of what we would call the superstructure of the society that we live in. The ideas about that society, whether they are expressed in politics, in art, in religion, in law even. All of these things together inform what culture is. So a lot of students really don't pay attention to it because it's not within their purview, their overview of the world. And if we don't even do that with our own culture, why should students be expected to do that to another culture? Well, the simple answer is if you don't, you're going to be missing out on an awful lot of, well, global communication at the very least. Okay, so the second objection, if the first one has any merit, then a one-week study of intercultural communication, if anything, there's the possibility that it could lead us down into sort of thinking about stereotypes. And in the ideas that we present, what we're trying to do is to not sort of collapse an entire complex and rich culture into just one or two ideas. That's a stereotype. In fact, that's a caricature. We don't want to do that either. So the typical kind of way of thinking is looking at people from a certain culture and assuming that every single person, let's say from Colombia, has a different concept of time. And then you can make a bigoted statement such as, well, because people in Colombia have a different concept of time, they always seem to be late for meetings. Okay, that's bordering on racist. Is that true of every single Colombian, every single person you've ever met? Because that's a lot of people you got to meet. So when we're making broad general statements, always, never, these kinds of things are called absolutes. So we need to be very careful with making those kinds of statements. I can say, for example, that my limited exposure to staying in Florida for 1 week, I came up with the same conclusion, that it seemed like everybody that I interacted with in Florida, this is way back in 1980, a long time ago, 41 years ago, It seemed that, people would tell you, like, I'll see you about noon hour. And it was 3:30 when they'd show up. So I had this sort of assumption that people down in Florida just have a different conception of time. They either don't own a watch or time means something different to them. Now, is that every single Floridian? No. It happened to be the people I interacted with. So when we are talking about, always late or never doing something, let's be very careful. Because when we make statements like that, we're dealing in absolutes, and ultimately we're dealing with stereotypes. So whether people from Colombia or individuals from Japan that have a different concept of respect for authority, the end result is that, they'll never challenge authority. Well, that's changing. It's changing in a big way. So we need to be careful when we make these statements, especially statements that contain these absolutes. Okay, the third one is the study of culture is very reasonable, but perhaps it's something that business students should really concern themselves with. And certainly the teachers of English and communication and writing should maybe stay away from it. Okay, that's a really loaded statement, because when you think of culture, you think about the ideas of a society, and the ideas of a society are expressed through language. That's why we're here. We communicate with one another with language, the written word, the spoken word, through images, through symbols and metaphors and iconic imagery and so on. All of that, if you were to ignore that which belongs to another culture, as well as your own, you're really missing out on what the world really is like today, right? That reality of globalization. If you willfully ignore another culture and think that it's not worthy of study, you are going to find yourself limited more and more in the business world, but also in the regular world, because to not interact with other cultures is not a healthy thing, because the world feels like it's getting smaller every day. We can interact with people literally around the world using social media. So why wouldn't we, right? Why wouldn't we expand our sense of communication, expand our understanding and our ability to communicate with others who are unlike us, who are merely different? When we speak a different language, live in a different place, live under other different cultural conditions, but that doesn't mean that we can't speak to them. Sociologists, yes, can study it, anthropologists as well, and they give us really good ideas, but those ideas can be imported into the study of communication actually quite easily. And surprise, it has been this way since, let's say, the last 10, 15 years. For a certain period of time, IQ, right, intelligence quotient was important and considered to be really a self-evident thing, which is what the word axiomatic means. So the importance of IQ is self-evident for sure, but then something called EQ, emotional intelligence, became really important. So in other words, intelligence about others' emotional states became something that was considered a leadership quality. To empathize, to sympathize with people, became a worthy quality that a leader would possess to be considered a good leader. Now, over the last 10, 15 years, roughly, we've had a shift to include not only IQ and EQ, but also what's called CQ, cultural intelligence. So we have intellect, an emotional intelligence, and now a cultural intelligence. And this cultural intelligence, if you have it, you will do well regardless, whether it's in business or in everyday interactions. You will less likely be racist or bigoted or prejudicial or biased against other people. You will meet and learn about people one-on-one, and you will reserve judgment until you know that person. And once you know that person, then you can make comments about that person, not the culture that they're from, or the language they speak, or the country they're from, because they're only one person. And really, we need to be very careful about, again, making these absolute statements, always, never. We need to be careful. So if that's the case, if studying other cultures is an important aspect of communication, well, how do we go about it? Well, one of the best ways is to look at a case study. And if you are in the business world, case studies are often done. In the health sciences, case studies are also very, very useful. And so if you were to do that and say, okay, I want to study other cultures, I need a toolkit, right? I need theories and ideas about other cultures that will allow me to understand them. So you do it with a case study, and certainly the work of Edward Hall is probably a good place to start, because Hall's work is very straightforward. It doesn't require a degree in sociology or anthropology, but he himself was an anthropologist. But what he's really gifted at doing is not simplifying, but reducing his ideas to their essence. And some of the things that he's talked about here, some of the kind of, we'll call them the central concepts in his work, things like high versus low cultural context. We're going to look at that in a moment. What he calls monochronic versus polychronic cultures. A culture that is sort of, we'll say perhaps pure in the sense that it's not been changed in any significant way by the influx of other cultural conditions and acculturation from other areas of the world. So it's simpler, it's not as complex, it's more monochromatic, sort of a kind of a singular sort of thing, rather than a polychronic or many cultures. North America, for example, is probably a good example of a polychronic culture, because it is a culture made up of many others. There's no sort of specifically Canadian culture or American culture. It is a kind of polyglot of many other cultures, which are the result, or which is the result of all of the immigrants that have come to Canada or to the US over the last 150 years, 200 years. So each of them bring to the table their own particular points of view, perhaps their language, their dress, their food, their way of life, the way they see the world. So rather than monochronic, singular, it's polychronic, it's many, it's pluralistic. That's, if you're a sociologist, this would be a pluralistic society or pluralistic culture. And then finally, proxemics is this notion of personal space. And what Hall says is that this notion of proxemics or personal space is different around the world. Again, we're not going to be making value judgments. We're simply going to talk about how personal space is viewed differently around the world. These are the covers to a couple of Hall's most famous books. The Silent Language on the left-hand side, that came out in 1959, Beyond Culture in 1976. Both of these books are standard texts that you'll see in communication classes, because what Hall has to say to us as an anthropologist really helps us as communicators, and that is good to know. So a couple of things that we can consider in terms of our work as communicators. He writes, for example, in 1990 on page 25, culture controls behavior in deep and persisting ways, many of which are outside of awareness and therefore beyond conscious control of the individual. So culture controls behavior, and this is a kind of control that is not even seen or felt until someone else points it out to you. And often these are people that are not living in your own culture. They're kind of reminding you, hey, you have this funny way of saying something, or you have this funny way of standing really close or really far away from me. It's not until someone from another culture points it out to you that you realize that you do things a certain way, almost without thinking about it. So culture does control behavior and thinking about behavior in very persistent ways. And for the most part, right, we aren't aware of it. It's outside of our awareness until someone points it out. But it's also beyond our control in a conscious way, because we think this is the right way to do things. Now, when we say right, we want to make sure that we imply that it's one way amongst many, right? It's one way of doing things amongst many other ways of doing the same thing. So when we start saying that, ours is the best way, well, we're now beginning to think in a kind of a racist sort of way, because, or at least in a Eurocentric or ethnocentric even kind of way, that, that our way of communicating and acting and thinking and behaving and so on is the best. It's only one amongst many. End of discussion. Okay, that's the first one. The culture controls behavior in ways that we are unaware. Culture in its entirety is a form of communication. As I mentioned at the beginning, when we think of culture, we're thinking of expressions of that society, intellectual ideas, intellectual thoughts, and intellectual images of what that society consists of, what it values, what it considers to be important. And it's expressed in art, religion, politics, and especially in language. And finally, the third one, culture hides as much more than it reveals. And what it hides most effectively from its own participants. When culture is really effective, it may control behavior and thought and language, but it does it most effectively to those who are part of it. And again, it's not until someone else from a different part of the world talks to you that they can point it out. In my case, I was born and grew up in Quebec as a young boy. I came here to Ontario at the age of 9, and I was still already speaking English, but we still felt really kind of like outsiders. We just saw that people said and did things differently. Of course, they said them in English, but just weird expressions. As a kid, I remember hearing, well, same difference. I had no idea what that meant. It's either same or it's different. It can't be same difference. And it took a while for me to realize what that person meant. But it's one of these weird little things that people say and use it in English all the time, but forget that someone hearing it for the first time might just be kind of confused and go, what does that even mean? So culture does hide very well our ways of thinking. Okay, so let's kind of dig a little bit deeper into Edward Hall's book here. And he talks about this kind of the main thesis. And he says essentially this: we must learn to understand the out-of-awareness aspects of communication, the things that we are not conscious of, in other words. We must never assume that we are fully aware of what we communicate to someone else, because we're using body language, we're using inflection, we're using a vocabulary that is agreed to within that culture. That's what he means. There exists in the world today tremendous distortions in meaning as men try to communicate with one another. The job of achieving understanding and insight into mental processes of others is much more difficult, and the situation more serious than most of us care to admit. In other words, the way we think and the words we use to express these thoughts really says a lot about who we are. And this is why we're asked to carefully consider our language when we are writing to another business associate. It could be someone within our own, province or country, but even more so when we are writing to someone overseas or living simply in a different part of the world. They could be north or south of us or on the other side of the world. So if we are suddenly made aware that a lot of things that we say and do are kind of blind to us because we just think, well, that's the way we've always done it, we need to stop and think. Say, well, how many other things are we saying and doing that we are simply not thinking about? And that's what Hall means when he says, it's more serious than most of us care to admit. If we stop and think carefully about how culturally conditioned we are, we realize that many things that we consider important or unimportant have a lot to do with the culture that we live in. And it's good to know about it. The second one in the same book, quote, the best reason for the layperson to spend time studying culture is that she can learn something useful and enlightening about himself or herself. This can be an interesting process, at times harrowing, but ultimately rewarding. One of the most effective ways to learn about oneself is by taking seriously the cultures of others. It forces you to pay attention to those details of life which differentiate them from you. Why is it that people have different ideas of personal space? Why is it that people use different kinds of metaphors or in language? Why is it that in North America we use a lot of sports metaphors, while in other parts of the world metaphors may come from a different part of culture? It's good to know. It's good to know these things, because then that way you can understand that person in a more sort of complicated complicated way rather than just simply on the surface. This is simply a business associate. Well, if you wish to do business with them over a longer period of time, nothing wrong with getting to know them a little bit. So the last thing here that I want to talk about is this notion of proxemics, right, or personal space, and the space in which, the space we occupy, the space we occupy with others is very important. And here we can see a diagram where that intimate space, that's us, that's actually us, that's what's right there, intimate space, ourselves. We have a kind of an idea of personal space, which is sort of 1.5 feet. Anyone that stands closer than that to us, we consider them to be more intimate towards us. Of course, beyond that is a kind of social space, 4 feet. Now remember, social distancing right now implies 6 feet. So that social space is now much bigger. And then from there, we have the public space of just being out in a parking lot or in a community center or a market somewhere. And that public space extends roughly 25 feet. So we have different configurations of space that mean different things. In other words, the further away you are from a person, the more they consider to be just in a public space. The closer they get to us, the more intimate and personal that relationship becomes. And it's only about space. Now, the other issue that Edward Hall talks about is this notion of high versus low context. This will become important in the assignment that's coming up for this week. Now, what does he mean by this? What he means is the relationship between context and information. And he says in a high context culture, meaning is conveyed more through context than through information. Let's say a person speaking or a person behaving in a certain way, where this takes place is as important as what is being said or what is happening. So the context in which these things occur, that words are uttered or actions are performed, the context matters just as much. Now compare that to a low context culture where meaning is conveyed primarily through information. There's more detail on information than on context. So let's say in a courtroom in North America, North American courtroom would say, just the facts. I don't want you to hypothesize. I don't want you to infer. I don't want you to guess. Did you see so-and-so enter this building? Yes or no? And so what happens here, the information in a low context culture is primarily sort of yes or no answers. In a high context culture, it would be yes, but, right? Or no, but. So here we are very aware of the context in which these actions or these words are uttered and how they color and influence what will occur as a result of it. So in the middle, we have sort of 50%, context and information. We go to high culture, where, as you can see, the diagram is such that there's much more information that is coming from the context versus down here, where it's much more about information. So regardless, we have this awareness now that in certain cultures, the context in which events occur matters to a great degree. Okay, so a low context culture, just the facts, ma'am, that may not mean anything to you, but it was a famous line from a TV show back in the 1960s called Dragnet, and basically the chief detective, that was his famous saying, just the facts, ma'am. And that's really a good way to kind of encapsulate what a low context culture really is. Just the facts. I don't care where this happened, what was said, what was done. And then we start moving up from Switzerland to Germany to North America, where we have a little bit of awareness of context. And then we keep moving up to finally Japan and China, where, again, we have a high context culture. It's all about the context, more so almost than what is being said or what is happening. Now, again, we don't want to stereotype. We don't want to say these are absolutes, because these diagrams, as you can see, this was 1989. So we're talking 30 years ago. This was the way that Edward Hall saw these various cultures. And if a culture is pluralistic, the likelihood is that these high and low context culture positions are probably slowly changing, because you can't have a pluralistic society and still maintain what it would be a monotheistic culture, one that is singular, that is kind of pure and simple and basic. And I don't mean that in any kind of intellectual way, but it is made up of fewer parts. So a pluralistic society made up of many, many parts. So these high context and low context positions may be changing slightly, or have over the last 30 years. So let's be careful not to make a stereotype here. Okay, so these are ideas that Hall presents to us that have to do with not just personal space, but what is occurring, what is being said, and what is happening, the actions occurring within that context. So he says this is a book by Seward. Says that Japan is a high concept culture. This often means less needs to be said to communicate the message. For to spell things out clearly, in other words, to be direct, is often used by the Japanese as crass, to come out and say something directly. Perhaps a pause, right? A pause, which is not even a word, it's silence. The silence speaks just as importantly. Or perhaps the individual looks away from the person. Even just that action, the context in which it occurs, means, this person is saying no to what you have just proposed, but they're doing it in a very indirect kind of way. So this notion of indirectness, depending on culture to communicate, is pervasive in Japanese culture and language. Consider this note on the use of the word no. That particular word we need to use carefully. So he says, ask the question, will you eat this? The English speaker will say no, or no, I won't. Now, if a Japanese is asked the same question, they would answer no, or even no, I won't eat this, and be perfectly understood. But his preference would be to answer, I won't eat it. Okay, thereby avoiding E entirely, right? Which is no. So to be sure, even more likely that he would say something like, it is fine, meaning he is fine without eating anything. It's kind of like when someone offers you food, and it's not the tastiest thing that you've ever had, and you say, oh no, I'm good, I'm full. Maybe you're full, maybe you're not. But what you're doing is you're deferring. You are deferring, saying no. You're certainly not saying, I don't want any because it tastes awful. I mean, you're a guest, and this person's made this food. Maybe not very successfully, but they made this food. So we can defer and be indirect, right? We're not being explicit. We're simply saying, no, thank you very much. I'm full. It was delicious. You can say that. But you are deferring and saying no in a very indirect kind of way. So these kinds of things we need to be aware of. Finally, we talked very briefly about time and space. Just a few slides back, we're talking about, speaking in absolutes. And really what Hall finds is ideas about time and space are really where cultures change the most. And he says in Beyond Culture, Americans speak of time, saving time, time spent, time lost, time made up, slowed down. Time is money, right? Time is crawling or running out. And so these metaphors, he says, should be taken very seriously because they express the basic manner in which time is conceived as an unconscious determinative or frame of which everything else is built. So he calls it M time, a monochronic time, is used as a classification system that orders life. With the exception of birth and death, all important activities are scheduled. You make time to visit the doctor, to visit your friends, to go to school, to get up to go to work. Everything is structured. Time is a purely structured phenomenon that is crucially important. If people ask you to be somewhere at a certain time and you're not, they're upset. So this is something that that a North American person, until it's pointed out to them, may not even realize it. The fact that birth and death and everything in between is all structured and scheduled. And this is how we view time, that we shouldn't waste time, that it's a valuable commodity. And it's true. And certainly this pandemic has reminded people that, yes, time is a valuable thing. And a lot of it has been spent traveling to and from school, to and from work, and just to and from wherever. And now that we're kind of being asked to stay at home, we realize that, wow, time is a beautiful thing. We can just relax and just kind of decompress and just enjoy being somewhere, or even just enjoy being just that. We don't schedule something like that in our present day activities as they typically are, right? Not in a pandemic, but in a regular workaday world. Now, Hall then talks about, by a comparison, he says, an economist once told me that Eskimos working in a fish cannery, or Inuit is what it should be called, working for a fish cannery in Alaska, thought factory whistles were ridiculous. The idea that men would work or not work because of a whistle seemed to them sheer lunacy. For the Inuit, the tides determined what men did, how long they did it, and when they did it. Tide out meant one side of activities, tide in another. So this was kind of a natural way of controlling time, or being aware of time, which, because it works on a natural equilibrium, sometimes it might work slightly faster depending on the time of the year, but the Inuit population used the tides as a way to measure time. So instead of a calendar, they simply looked at the tide and where it was, if it moved out or it moved in. So it is an awareness of time, but of a different kind, a time that is a little bit more fluid, pun intended, of course, because it is a tide, but the notion that at various times of the year, that tide may move in and out more slowly or more quickly, and the Inuit population adjust accordingly. But the notion of an arbitrary whistle, just blowing at 4 p.m. or 7 a.m., they just found was strange. It wasn't natural. That's what it was. It wasn't natural. So these are just some ideas I'd like you to consider. When we meet later this week, I'm going to talk about the assignments. I'm going to sort of go through it in a fair amount of detail, but it is looking at a couple of short passages from Edward Hall's book, and then applying some of these ideas to your own lives as business students or students traveling either within your own country where you're from, or even traveling here to Canada. So hopefully you'll have a chance to kind of explore these ideas and then apply them to yourselves. It's kind of a lot of fun. So the last slide here is just basically our references. And these are all books that we've already referred to. Edward Hall's book, Beyond Language, or Silent Language, Beyond Culture, and so on. And then the Learning Basic Japanese by Stewart. So we will see each other very shortly in a few days. In the meantime, enjoy the weekend, and we'll see you soon.